The Cold War was the longest conflict in American history, yet there was no direct conflict between Russian and American troops. It was referred to as cold because neither nation dared heat it up into what would ultimately become a nuclear situation. There are four main aspects of the war during which foreign relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were at their worst. The first is the conflict between East and West Germany. There are many causes that led to the disunification of this country. It is possible that post-war disagreement between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin set the stage for conflict, as the three world leaders could not find common ground on how to treat Germany and Eastern Europe following World War II. Eastern Germany was under the influence of communism because the Soviet Union refused to give up its claims to this land. The Russians also felt threatened by the West's presence in West Germany. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II, therefore, began to break apart because the Russians refused to leave Eastern Germany, and West Germany did not want the United States' presence to leave, for fear that they too would be taken over by communism. The country was torn in half between two powerful spheres of influence, communism from the Soviets and democracy from the Americans. Winston Churchill described the division between these two types of government as the Iron Curtain in Europe. These two nations used proxy wars to keep the Cold War cold, so that nuclear war would not break out. This was the overall goal of foreign policy at the time. Powerful countries would use less powerful countries as pawns in their conflicts. This policy was extremely evident in the Korean War, in which Korea had split into two countries, Communist North Korea and non-Communist South Korea. The North's desire to invade and conquer the South and spread communism alarmed America. After 3 years of fighting, hostilities ended essentially where they began, at the 38th parallel. The two nations, Communist North Korea and Democratic South Korea, are technically still at war today, and approximately 30,000 United States troops are still stationed in North Korea. In South Korea. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we ever came to World War III, and it brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Union had moved nuclear missiles into Cuba, capable of hitting targets in the United States. This was more than likely a response to the U.S. invasion of the Bay of Pigs, and was meant as a deterrent to future United States invasions. The Americans obviously saw this as a direct offensive threat to the homeland, rather than a defensive assistance for Cuba. This led to a tense, 2-week period where all-out nuclear war seemed imminent. The situation was ultimately diffused, but Kennedy and Khrushchev were both very shaken by the drastic nature of this conflict and its potential repercussions. They began a pattern of nuclear deals. The two nations decided from then on to take a step back and have treaties banning atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons and reducing overall numbers of nuclear weapons. Foreign policy changed from massive buildup of nuclear weapons and stockpiling them to agreeing to disagree and mitigating risk of all-out nuclear war. The United States and the Soviet Union tried to find common points of agreement and keep the danger of nuclear war to a minimum. This conflict between communism and democratic ideals played out again in the next decade in Vietnam, with a communist northern government and a non-communist South. After Kennedy's failure at the Bay of Pigs and his inability to resolve the German crisis with Khrushchev, the president felt he needed to draw a line in the sand. In his 3 years in office, the number of American troops in Vietnam grew from a few hundred to 16,000 troops. Once again, this conflict did not involve direct conflict with the Soviet Union. It was a proxy war that involved United States and South Vietnamese forces versus Soviet-backed North Vietnamese forces. The aftermath of America's longest and most controversial war led to new foreign policy, détente, or peaceful coexisting with one's enemies, engineered by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. It led the United States to a less confrontational approach with the Soviet Union. The two nations essentially agreed to disagree and stop their policies of proxy wars and nuclear buildup. The frosty relations of the 1950s and 60s between the United States and the Soviet Union eventually led to improved relations in the 1970s and 80s, with the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s.